I had a friend of mine, she passed away because when she was 50 years ago. And back then, I don't know if they do it now or not, but she was having to get like their gold shots, actually gold. And that was so expensive that eventually she couldn't do it anymore because she didn't have the money. But she did pass away from that.
This lady I knew, she had the thing with her hand so bad that she had some bees, some bumblebees. And we take the bees. Yeah.
I heard that too. Well, you always going to have something, you know. It's always something.
It's not one thing, it's another.
Yeah, and often 3 or 4.
Arthur, Reuben,
Yeah.
Roosevelt.
Be grateful that you, what things you don't have.
Yeah, be grateful. Be grateful
That
that
you're able to walk.
walking around and get up in the morning.
I pray every day, thank you, Jesus, because,
Yeah.
you know, all these people are so sick. So many people I've been hearing about are being diagnosed with that Daer's disease. It comes on, you know, later on, and that don't last very long.
Have somebody who will put out a set on
Disease.
A lot of sick people were. We try to pray for them every day. You know, in the morning, my wife and I, we pray in the nighttime, and I always pray, you know, for the food. I thank God, but not just for the food, because I have hands that I can feed myself, and legs that I can get up and get it.
Yeah.
People don't have that.
Have you heard that old illustration about the difference between heaven and hell? The guy dreams that he's transported to heaven, and he wants to know what is there really a hell too? Because he's got friends he's concerned. Oh yeah, we'll show you. So they transport him to hell. And hell is a banquet.
It's a banquet.
Banquet. Sumptuous banquet tables just piled with wonderful, tasty, aromatic food. And everybody has stiff arms. And he says, okay, now I'm ready to go to heaven. So they take him, so they take him to heaven, and he walks in, and the heaven is banquet tables full of food, and everybody has stiff arms. But in heaven, everybody is feeding the person across the table from them.
That reminds me of an old Twilight Zone. You know, back in the 60s, I don't know why this always stuck with me, but this man, he was a librarian, and he loved to read. He was just one of those nerds, that's all he wanted to do. And so, you know, he had classes and reading and reading. Well, the world was gonna end, you know, but he didn't really care, because he was gonna be left here quiet with all his books. And so he's out looking through, you know, these books that go, you know, going around. And I'll never forget this. And then he stumbled and broke his glasses. And he like, oh, isn't that sad? He can't read that. And I thought, yeah, that would happen to me. The Twilight Zone, they would always have that catch, you know, in the end.
I'll never forget the one where there were these two guys in prison, and they had to make a plan to escape.
Oh, okay.
One of them was going to get in a coffin when the next prisoner died. The other one made the coffins, and he would take them out and bury them.
Oh, I see it with that.
Yeah, since he was a trustee, he would make the coffins and they let him out to go bury them. Nobody wanted, the guard didn't want to go with him because it was out their way alone by himself. So they made a plan that when the next prisoner died, he was gonna make the coffin big enough that if the guy was small, one of them would get in there with him. So when the other guy would take him out there and bury him, he'd let him out. Well, he's down there in the coffin and he's buried now. And it's dark and he's looking for a match and he's waiting and he's waiting.
Or spend the day
Time go by, and he's waiting for his friend. And finally, he started to sweat and everything and looking for a match and he can't move around, he's running out of air. And finally, he finds the match and he strikes the match. And the man that's dead in the coffin is the one that was supposed to give it up.
Well, did you see that one where, they're in the operating room and you know, and everybody's masked and you just hear it. You don't really see anything, you see the patient there. They're going, horrible. It just looks horrible. I don't know what can we do? You know, this is just terrible. And they're talking, doctor and nurse and all that. And so at the very end, what you do is they scan down to the patient. And she is the most gorgeous, blonde-headed girl you ever want to see, about 25 years old. And then it goes up to the doctors, and you're like space aliens. And these eyes. And I said, well, that's Diddy is in the eye of the buffalo. And they thought she was really, really ugly. They didn't know what to do with her.
Well, that's a dollar.
Oh, that's a dollar. Oh, okay. We have to have me an account then. Thank you, Gloria. I can say I haven't heard of any of these except spirituality.
Yeah,
I don't know what
No.
it's Swedenborg or something.
yeah, it's Sweden, it's Swedenborg. Yeah,
I've never heard of it.
I
Those
Theosophy,
theosophy.
yeah. No, you won't because they're all very minor groups, but the principle behind them is far more widely thought of, used. Is to a great extent at the root of a lot of the New Age religious programs. The two terms, spiritism and spiritualism, you will frequently find used interchangeably or synonymously. The proponents of the ideas in the organization, the organized groups, make a major distinction between the two words. The primary and generic term spiritualism is used in philosophy as the opposite of materialism. Philosophically, there are four different views of reality. The first is the modern scientist. It's material. Everything is material. Everything is atoms and their component parts, the energies they produce, whatever. There is nothing besides the material. The opposite, of course, is that everything is spiritual. There is no material. There may appear to be material, but that's only an appearance. The major proponent of this that you might be familiar with is Christian Science. Fundamentally believes that the material does not exist, and therefore you don't have a material body that hurts. That's figment of your imagination, because there isn't a physical to hurt. Then, of course, between those two extremes are the two compromises. One in which the spiritual is the primary and the physical is secondary. And then the other, the opposite, where the physical is the primary, but there is some spiritual aspect, especially at the human level. And spiritualism is the view that the spirit is primary, either totally or at least primarily. Most Eastern religions, Hindu, Buddhism, are built on the spiritualist view that reality is fundamentally spiritual.
It's for eternity.
And it's for eternity.
For eternity.
And the spiritual beings are eternal. And they may or may not, various ones of them, interface at various stages in various ways with the material, i.e. us human beings. But we're fundamentally spiritual beings temporarily inhabiting some physical elements. And of course, in the Eastern religions, that includes all of the elements, physical and biological. So that you could come back as whatever. And since you are permanent, eternal, then depending on what their particular views are as to what your situation in this life is, whether it's the only time you're going to be here, or you're going to come back multiple times, and on what basis you can quit coming back, if ever. So then there's that whole variety of things. On the spiritual side, there's also the issue of what are these spirits? And you have the full gamut. Those who believe that things like us, spirits like us, are basically all the spirits there are. Some of us are better than others, i.e. all of us aren't Stalins or Hitlers. So there's some really bad ones, but that's maybe only while they're in this material body. It may not necessarily reflect their nature. They're not necessarily good, bad, or indifferent. They're in this stage. They may eventually get out of that and mature and become more kind, whatever. But the spirits are fundamentally all the same. They may have varying degrees of goodness or badness or powers, but they're fundamentally the same. And then you go all the way to the other extreme, where there are a whole variety of distinct spirits of different qualities, inherent powers, moral nature, the biblical view of a God and Satan, angels and demons, and the characters are all fixed. Now, they may not have been originally, maybe, but in our current circumstance, they're fixed. They're really bad spirits. They're really good spirits. They're spirits of varying degrees in between. Spiritualism is therefore fundamentally simply religion, because all religions are basically believing in some kind of spiritual existence. The spiritualists have varying degrees of religious quality based on the typical religious activities. Do they observe holy days? Do they have certain practices that are typical of religion? They all will have moral values because that's fundamental to what kind of spirit life you're living, but they may not have significant religious. Some spiritualists, you see this strictly as a, quote, scientific thing. I mean, how do you explain some of these phenomena that have existed in history and exist in this day, and especially if you've experienced some really weird things? How do you explain that? How do you explain the ability of the prophet? Whatever the prophet said, if he's right, how do you explain that? How do you explain certain people's apparent ability to even move objects without ever touching them?
You're talking about like people that say they're psychic.
Yeah, the psychics, the paranormal activities, the divination, clairvoyance. Numerous studies have been made on the basis of people being able to, for instance, pick a card and that they don't see. And there seem to be some people with a much higher degree of accuracy than some of the rest of us have. How do you explain Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha? You see, here's some people who really seem to be more aware of, more tapped into, more understanding of the spirit world than the rest of us.
How do you explain, I've seen this before, how do you explain when they do the past life regressions?
Yes.
Because they'll have people that will go back.
Yeah, tell about a previous life.
But
Yeah.
the problem with that, what makes me weird about it, I'm thinking, there must be something to it. Because they're speaking in German, or they're speaking in some foreign language that's never been around for 3 centuries.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you can't be making this stuff up.
Yeah, and see, that's the point. And so there are spiritualists who quote are scientific, and they're not interested in religious activities, prayer, religious services, gobbledygook and all that kind of stuff. They're pursuing this scientifically. The famous Houdini, the spiritualism that he got involved with when his mother died, and he was active in the days when the seances with the dead was very, very popular, and he pursued that as a scientific investigation. He wanted to find out, is this really possible? Is this really real? And there were people like him who became convinced it was and became very strong proponents for it. They're viewed from a scientific, investigative standpoint. And then you got the others that see this in a very religious and many even in a very superstitious way.
Well, I read with him that his wife, he asked his wife, I think, before he died. And so every birthday, they would have a seance.
Yeah.
I don't know if he ever talked to him or not, I'm not sure, it wasn't there. But yeah, so he really must have thought that there was something.
Well, except he was a pretty strong skeptic of it.
But he thought
and the afterlife experiences that people purport, and all this is viewed from a quote scientific investigative standpoint. So you have this.
I think they would believe in God though, because God's created them.
Yeah, but you don't have to do that if you believe that spirits are the reality. You don't have to necessarily have one of them who created them. You don't have to have a God. The spirits have always been here. And remember, in Hinduism, you're talking about something several thousand years before there was any inkling of scientific investigation of the material. And so the idea that spirits were eternal and what material things you had them work with clearly come and go. They come into existence, they decay, they disappear. Well, you know, the spirit is the reality. This other stuff, how it relates, you know. And so this idea about the nature of the spirits has been around forever. It's, you know, it's clearly there in the Bible, from the Old Testament to the New Testament. The ancient Chinese religion is fundamentally built on the quote veneration, if not the worship of the ancestors, because the spirits, they're still there. They're
bad ones, like demonic.
Yeah, you have good ones and bad ones. And the distinction you see then between the spirits and the quote gods is strictly a matter of degrees, strictly a matter of definitions of your descriptions and that kind of thing. In the Western world, this concern about the spirits had a very almost paradoxical experience, because with the rise of Christianity, there was, as in Judaism, the desire to reduce the power of these spirits significantly because God is sovereign. And biblically, in the biblical stories, you don't have very much interchange between the living and the spirits, either divine or human. There's just not much happening there. You have an occasional story. King Saul goes to the witch of Endor, and Samuel comes to meet him. Or at least talks to him. You have the encounters of Jesus and the demons.
You have the angels too.
And you have angels, except in the biblical language, that's terribly confused, because the Hebrew word and the Greek word for angel is strictly the word for messenger. There's nothing divine, nothing otherworldly about the word. It's the ordinary word for sending a messenger with a letter.
Angels among us.
And so when somebody sees an angel in our Bibles, you always have to remember that's a translation. This person was encountered by a divine messenger. Were they, quote, angelic, otherworldly? The person perceived them as an individual.
Yeah, but we know that they're otherworldly, they come from heaven. Just because you see them.
Yeah, but see, you say that, and that's my point. In many of the cases in the Bible, if you're reading that in the Hebrew or the Greek, all you see is there was a person here. In fact, in the resurrection story, it's two men standing, one at the head and one at the foot. Oh, they have on glistening clothes. But the writer doesn't say two angels, he says two men.
In the shape of an angel.
Yeah, all the appearance, there's no description except for a certain brilliance about them, about angels.
Is that in the Vulgate? In the Vulgate?
Yeah, it's in the Latin as well as it is in the Greek or the Hebrew. Now, in the Christian faith, we develop this very specific view, greatly elaborated about these heavenly beings. And so we read all of these encounters as angels, but the text doesn't require that.
Well, even if they're not angels, then what are you saying? Where are they coming from? You know, I mean, okay, we call them messengers, we're not calling them, but I mean.
All the prophets were messengers. This person saw a person. He saw a man. It doesn't say he was an angel. It doesn't say he wasn't an angel. He had an unusual appearance. And we read into that our understanding of an angelic being who momentarily takes on the appearance of a human being. Well, maybe this was a human being who simply was brightened for the occasion to tell these people this particular thing.
Well, that goes back to sometimes you hear about people saying, you know, you've heard it, I'm sure, that like there'll be an accident and there'll be somebody, like you said,
Yeah.
a man or a woman, you know,
Yeah.
you look like it, you
Yeah.
look like you, okay.
Yeah.
And you come over and you hop out of the car because the car's getting ready to explode. And so by that time, they've got the ambulance coming and all that, and you look around because you're okay.
And they're gone.
They're gone.
Yeah.
So is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I call that an angel.
Of course. You see,
They're here.
they're
They're here,
they're
but
and they're.
but they're not, but they don't live here. I think that they.
Well, again, you see, you know, the reality is
Somebody like Jungle Plumber.
remember Elisha and his servant and the advancing Assyrian army, and we're in trouble, the servant says, and Elisha says, no, look a little more carefully. And here's the whole host of God's army. You know, are we dealing with multidimensional realities here, you see?
Well, I think we are when somebody captures you out of the car. I think that is a spirit.
Well, and there are multitudes of stories like that.
I know, everybody's not like.
Yeah, involving both people that you didn't know, and cases where you knew the person.
And they've been dead to you.
And yeah, they've been dead. The classic one that I remember from several years ago that made the stories was a lady who was assaulted in Central Park. She was out walking at night when she shouldn't be, but she was walking because she was in grief from her husband's death. And she's assaulted.
We know where this is going.
And in the midst of the struggle, the guy suddenly lets her go because her husband is standing there. From the angelic standpoint, the last one I heard was of a missionary. I think it was in Africa. And he had made a trip from the bush into the city to get supplies and money for the mission. And he's on his way back, and it's a 2-day trip. And so he's spending the night. And in the middle of the night, he's awakened when he's surrounded by these ruffians who are attacking him. And just before they get to him, they flee. Months later, he's back in the States and he tells this story. And one of the guys comes up to him and says, what day did this happen? And when he describes the day and the time, the man says, my men's prayer group was in prayer that time. And one of our guys said, man, we need to pray for, named you by name. And we began to pray. And then he says, how many men attacked you? Same number of men in that prayer group.
Well, see, that's not what you do.
Of course.
I do that kind of stuff.
Of course, see? So that's,
You gotta be.
You know what I'm saying is, I guess I'm a spiritualist. I'm the one.
yes, you are.
Yay!
All Christians are spiritualists in terms of the fact we believe that there is a spiritual world in addition to this physical world. And we have varying degrees of our understanding of who those spirits are and their nature. And so there are segments of Christian groups who include in those spiritual beings all the dead Christians.
Well, is that why people, then some people, when they hear and see all of this, that would make me think that if I'm a spiritualist, then maybe this is, like, my life will be used that way too. What I'm trying to say is like,
Yes.
maybe I will be reincarnated. Maybe I will, and
Or even if,
back and help people.
if not reincarnated,
Or something I can come back and help.
be available in the spirit world to enter into, connect with the physical world, and even if not directly with the physical world, at least with spiritual people.
Well, see, but that's-
So I could encourage them and inform them.
Most things
What's the upcoming holiday on our calendar?
are
And what is Halloween? And Halloween is the evening before the Day of the Dead and All Saints' Day. What's the Catholic principle of praying to the saints? The saints are active. They can intervene on your behalf in a whole multitude of ways. And so,
They see spirits all the time and everything.
of course,
They have different saints for different things.
yeah. They went, well, what they've done is attach various things to various things. Yeah.
And some people really believe that. I mean,
Yes,
they
Yes.
to the saints.
yes, yes. A very active part of their religious experience involves the spirits of the dead.
I guess that how did that all of the Day of the Dead start? Isn't that, I mean, I didn't even hear about that till about 10 years ago.
Well, that's because it was not as popular in Northern European Catholicism. And so unless you grew up in a community that was heavily Catholic in this country, you would not have seen it. But it's very, very widely practiced in all of Central South American Catholicism. Yeah,
I know right over here at Fisher Elementary last year, they had a warrior there, a big, Day of the Dead. And,
Yeah.
Had a mask or pretty decorated.
yeah,
All that, but I didn't know what you were supposed to do. You're supposed to put people's names that had passed. Or
Yeah,
something. Is that
yeah.
what they do?
yeah.
But it was very pretty, but I just didn't, I knew of it by that time, but I didn't. But it's
The,
cool.
yeah,
It's cool.
the liturgy of the church involves a time of prayer where you mention the past Christians of the community. And that was such a popular thing in the medieval church that the Jewish synagogue copied it. And so now it's a regular part of the Jewish synagogue
I was
service.
just gonna ask you if the Jews practice something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, they do.
And they copied it from,
I went to a school where there was a very, very prominent Catholic liturgical expert, and he insisted that that was an adoption from the Christian, from the church.
from the Catholic Church?
Yeah, well, it would have been the medieval church.
Back
Yeah,
then, yeah.
yeah.
I think so, because they, you know, they're into everything. I mean, even look
Yeah.
back, I mean, come on.
Orange Park Cemetery, they have the day
Yeah,
they celebrate it.
Yeah.
They will have like a festival.
oh, yeah.
That's new though, I mean, probably the last 10 years.
I don't know, but I really feel bad too.
Oh, it's probably older than that at Forest Park.
I had dropped off my grandson and that time I was busy, but I wish I had gone with him. Because they were in a play in their school and that was part of the play.
Yeah,
So that's
Yeah.
why they were there and I
Yeah.
had to drop them off there. It's just really down the street where I live on
Yeah.
but
Well, I think it's good, it's a way to respect your people that have passed.
and it's this spiritualism
Yeah.
that breaks out in various places in Western Christianity at various times. One of the places that broke out was in the New England witches, Salem witches. That's an aspect of that spiritualism. This list that I've got here in 1844, this development begins that leads into the Swedenborg group. Bring up theirs here. He was a Swedish scientist who in his 50s becomes interested in the paranormal, the parascientific. And this becomes a greater and greater interest. And finally he writes his book on the spiritual background of the spiritual aspect of the world. And out of that eventually comes a church movement of people who give greater concern for, interest in, and in fact, they are still around. There you go. Here's their website.
Origin. That's what they are. huh?
Yeah, that's what they are.
You know,
They are a spiritualist church who puts greater emphasis upon our involvement with, our relationship with, our interaction with the spirits. Not just the Holy Spirit, not just but the full spiritual world.
You know, Disney made a movie about the Daer.
Yeah,
Coco.
yeah.
Very popular.
This is one of the groups
It's in
that,
Sweden, somewhere where, I hear read about. They believe a lot of science, but they also, like you're saying, spirit. They also believe like even before the earth was formed and all that, and you come up to when it was, there's like demons and all of this, and
Yeah.
can still come through portals or something into
Yeah.
us today. And that's all located in Sweden.
well, it's all Scandinavian.
Well, is that, so they're,
I don't know I don't know to what degree they go back to old Scandinavian mythology and involve those gods. I don't know to what degree they do that. They may be, and the distinction that you ultimately get in the spiritualism and spiritism.
But they go to places where people have died.
Yeah.
Under hypnosis.
Yeah, now see, what you have going is, here's the background of the term spiritism. This is a Frenchman. He's on the little handout I gave you. He wrote under the name of Karnak. He was a spiritualist who was fundamentally interested in this spiritual world, and he ultimately produces this 5-volume set on the spirits, in which he organizes the spirits, I think 10 levels of spiritual beings. The spiritism, and he's the one who invents the word spiritism, because he wants to give a special title to his particular view of spiritualism. So instead of calling himself just a spiritualist, he calls himself a spiritist. So he has, and in many of the discussions that you'll find about the difference, that's part of the difference, is that spiritism is a specifically organized subset of these spiritualists.
Spiritism?
Yeah, and spiritism is this more organized view. And there are several different approaches to that, but they've established the various levels and character, nature of these beings, and that kind of thing. Whereas the spiritualist may not be that concerned about trying to make all that differentiation. Now, when this begins to break out in this country, it comes fundamentally from the background of probably the simplest term for English is ghosts. And it frequently involved, when it exploded publicly first, it was the spiritism of the living, of the dead. What you will frequently find called in some of the discussions on language, on religion, and divination, particularly necromancy, though dealing with the dead.
What's the definition of that?
Pardon? Necromancy. Necromancy. And that's the mancy of the necro. Necro is the Greek word for dead. This is just the intercourse with the dead. King Saul and Samuel encounter. And you see, that's not the demon aspect of the New Testament. Those beings are never explained. And as I tell most people, most what you read about demons, like most what you read about angels, even in Christian writers, is imagination. It ain't in the Bible.
What about in Isaiah? Is there something about that in Isaiah?
Oh, yes. There's several. The dealing with the dead, relating to the dead, is one of the frequently forbidden aspects in the Old Testament. Depending on what terminology, what translation they use. It was a forbidden practice. It was an abomination to the Lord. Mainly because it was simply an attempt to try to get around the sovereignty of God.
And that was one of the things that they had asked of Samson, for Samson not to ever touch the dead, that was related to.
That's probably the Nazarite not touching and the high priest not touching the dead is probably somewhat related to that. But it also could simply be the fact that the corpse was seen as somewhat of a corrupted and unclean, And the reality, of course, if somebody died, quote, naturally, there's always the possibility there really was something wrong. And so the less contact you have with it, the better.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to go around.
But here you're dealing, you see, with the spirit of the dead. And the reality is there is almost no discussion of that in the Bible. You get the encounters, but you don't get the descriptions. You don't get the explanations. You meet Gabriel and Michael, but you don't get very clear descriptions. And when you do, it's clearly in figures.
Well, remember when I mentioned to you that at Eastern Orthodox, I was surprised as I looked it up, that they believe that once you die, that your spirit is here on earth and it stays here for 40 days.
Yeah.
And during that time, as your loved ones, you honor them and all, but they're supposed to be able to watch to see how their funeral's going.
Yeah.
They say they go to the grave. And then even in some, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think some Christian churches, don't they believe that you stay around as a spirit?
Oh,
3 days?
there's all kinds.
I'd rather be 40 days.
Yeah. There's all, and
So that's back to spirituality. So everybody's thinking that.
yes.
Are they saying they're actually, this is probably not, do they think they see them sometimes? Is that
Yes.
how it started?
Yes, and
I think they saw for 40 days.
that they were around in, remaking her bed or.
And that is actually part of their Eastern Orthodox.
Oh, yeah.
And these churches.
And there are varieties of that kind of thing, if not in the express teaching of the church, in the popular mythology of the people in the church. That's why you had up until modern days and still do in some groups, wakes, and people stayed around the body for a day or two. That's why you quickly buried the body so that the spirit would not have any chance to come back.
Well, they don't involve.
No, because they want it buried the same day.
The same day.
Yeah, they want you buried by nightfall. Judaism. In Judaism,
And now,
their preference is for you to be buried before the sun goes down.
they don't get any kind of involvement or anything.
Yeah.
It has to be just like the one.
And they want you buried. And part of the background of that is this: what happens to the spirit when it leaves the body?
But your spirit will probably.
How long does it hang around? Where does it go when? And that's all, and it's the differences within church groups is probably as much ethnically and therefore as much in the background of the pre-Christian mythologies that existed as it is in the Christian, because in the Bible, there's nothing about any of that in terms of times and issues like that. So that clearly comes from a different source, and that's why it varies from culture to culture, from religious group to religious group. This is the background of our ghosts, because in most cultures, the ghost is somebody who's still hanging around. The spirit hasn't been able to rest yet. And so it's still haunting the place, the person, the event, because it hasn't been able to rest yet.
I've heard that too, but just think back in the old days before the embalmed and all that. Like if you had a seizure or something, you were just out, well, you might wake up the next day. And
Yeah, well, even worse than that, y'all know where the phrase "saved by the bell" came from. You don't? When they buried people in medieval Europe, they frequently tied a string to their finger and ran the string through the closed grave to a bell.
That's right.
If the person revived in the grave, they could wiggle their finger and ring the bell and hope somebody heard it and could dig fast enough to get them out before they ran out of air.
Is that why Jews don't involve?
And for them to do that, that's probably what happened.
Of course it happened. They would remember in much of Europe to this day in many places, graves were only temporary. You buried the body for a few years for the flesh to decay. Then you went in and you collected the bones up and put them in a smaller box and stuck them somewhere so you could reuse the grave. And so it would not be an uncommon experience for them to dig up the grave to get the bones out and find that the body was clearly distorted, contorted in some way that indicated they were trying to get back out.
Well, you know, that's like if you go to New Orleans, they have, you know, real old cemetery and people that still own those, like you're saying, they put the body in there and they let it go for like July the 4th to July the 4th, just 1 year, and then they go in and take the bones, but they will leave them there, but then there has space for another body.
Yeah,
But they still do that today.
yeah, and many places still done.
I know about being in there.
So when the spiritualism began to explode in this country in the 1800s, it was these kinds of experiences that were involved. Let me bring that one back up here. You have the two famous Fox sisters who heard clicking noise, and Margaret and Kate, and they become great celebrities, repeat these experiences. Some relative ratted on them late in life and insisted they learned how to make that noise with their toes.
Movie goes.
Yeah, yeah. And all kinds of people get involved in this because there seems to be all of these experiences that you can't explain that indicate spirits are around, are active. And eventually you get organizations in 1893, this National Spiritualist Association, and all kinds of things that are involved. This movement is prolific in Brazil from Portugal. As a result of the man I mentioned who wrote under the name Allan Kardec and his 5 volumes, that's a big thing there. The spiritists, the organized spiritists, because they believed in the variety of these spirits, ultimately developed the idea that we're fundamentally all the same. We're in a progression. We're moving to become better and better spirits. Some of us haven't gotten there. Some of us take a long time. Some of us view that as available to achieve only in this life, only in a physical life, much as Hinduism. Obviously, this is where you function. This is where you got a brain to think. You got a mouth to speak. You got ears to listen, to learn, will to begin to change your behavior. And so it's in this life that you can make some progression, but you're going to be able to make that progression better if you rely on some of the spirits that have already made it, you pay attention to them, and so forth.
Don't you think though, like when you hear these people that graduate from college at 10 years old, and they'll tell you when they were like 4 years old, they were in World War II and all that. So aren't you bringing some of this in with you? You don't really need a lot of experience. I mean,
Well,
if
that
we're
is,
creative, we probably have a lot of that, and we don't know it, but it's like, I like something, and you don't like something. Well, it's probably something that's ingrained that I don't even know, you know.
yeah, and you get this,
I look at what I like, if I'm funny, if I'm not, you know, quiet.
and you get that full range again
From there.
of where this comes from. If you believe in reincarnation, as the organized spiritists all do, then you have brought all kinds of things from previous worlds with you. One of them, did you?
So when you do here, I know a guy that when he was up until about 5 years old, now it's pretty common, but Jimmy would tell his parents and all, and I was about the same age, and they would be like this story later. But he knew his name, everything. He was a fighter pilot, he was in World War II, he knew it all. And now you hear that occasionally, but back then you didn't. And so they're like, what? But he did that until he was about 5 years old, and there was no more. And they would talk with friends and everybody.
Yeah.
And now they're on TV, you know, here's this kid, you know. But back in those days, it was sort of like, he's weird, you know, stuff. But I mean, he was really telling, I think, the truth.
This,
So something is going on. I don't know.
yeah, this man, Franz Mesmer, who, for all practical purposes, you know, kind of creates hypnosis, perfects it at least. And so sometimes you'll hear it called mesmerism instead of hypnosis. He's involved in these kind of things because under hypnosis, you far more commonly have people telling about a former life, relating experiences, and this kind of thing. So this becomes involved with it. One of the other groups that has some of this same kind of thing is this Theosophy group. It's an organized group, basically growing out of this work of Helena Blavatsky. And their view has a lot of roots in Hinduism and Buddhism because she and her cohort actually go to the Middle East and actually end up, one of them ends up staying there. She eventually goes back to London. But their slightly different take on this is that among these spirits, there are significant communicators who can come to you on an ongoing basis and really get you up to speed. Messiahs, Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, and they have some others. And then you get this outgrowth of people who have these visits from a character who then relays to them. And does that sound familiar to Joseph Smith? And a visit from Moroni, the angel. See, yeah. I'm going to show you this, and I'm going to help you translate it. And what does he use to help translate it? And there are all kinds of varieties to that story, but you get into this same kind of thing.
But that goes back to like the Catholics. I mean, what is it? France, is it Lawrence or Lawrence?
Yes.
They sing Mary, and the children have seen this spirit. But that's been going on forever, so that's not any different than the one.
No, it's not.
And it's a religion that everybody is really.
And people get upset with me when they ask my view about Mormonism, and I reply by saying, well, they have a different variety of traditions, but in many respects, they're not a whole lot different. than the medieval church with its saints and all the stories of the saints and the relics and the holy sites where healings take place, the exorcisms. You're dealing with the same ideas. It can, and in many cases, you see, it has the same source there that it had in these others. It came from the popular religion's pre-Christian faith and mythologies of the cultural group that it emerged out of. It wasn't was organic to the Christian faith. It was brought into the Christian faith from this pre-Christian substrata of mythologies. And that's why you see it, once it starts, there is ever opportunity for it to grow, because even if the staid Protestants are going to speak against it, and maybe occasionally even the Catholic priests, the people who are involved in it know that it's not that different. It goes by a different name. It may involve a different sub-deity. What's the difference if I see this holy being, this spiritual being who comes to me to fill me in on some information that's not in the Bible? What's the difference between him or her and this angel that spoke to Joseph or to Mary?
The Virgin Mary,
See?
south, they say that they see her.
Yeah.
She goes out. Yeah.
I mean, look at the different, we'll understand Catholics again. I mean, people say that they're money for years to go to some of these sites.
Yeah.
It's very holy to them.
Yes.
And so, and now Joseph Smith, I guess because he didn't have a lot of money back in him, so he said he saw this, and people are going, man, but it seems like some people are obviously believing because they want to be the churches and all that. I mean, it's just about the same,
Yeah.
thing that runs through all these religions.
There is not that fundamental difference. They're all dealing with spiritual ideas, and some of them become more organized than others. And so the Theosophy group is
Trying to
around.
answer the question like, where
Here they are.
they come from, and
Yeah.
I think there's a theme,
Sure.
Man's wants answers, and so if they can't, they try to come up with something,
Yeah.
And then and I do believe there probably has been spirits that have come to these people.
One of these, One of these websites I looked at today, in fact, you see, uses that very approach. Man has always longed for an understanding of where did I come from, why am I here, where am I going? And the only difference is, where do I get my information to answer those three questions? Am I satisfied with this organized, traditional church movement, Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant? Or am I more convinced that there are other sources, or at least additional sources, to inform me about this topic? Why should I necessarily believe this group over my own experience or my own intuition?
Well, can't you have both? Can't you still be a believer in Christ and still realize that there may be something to this other? I mean, you have to be one or the other.
No, in fact, most people aren't. The reality is that most traditional Christianity at least till the very modern age, contain all of these experiences, as we just mentioned. The medieval church had this whole array of traditions, understandings, focuses of the spirit world. It gets suppressed in the Protestant world more because of the Enlightenment and the emerging scientific and emerging secular view, that more and more of this gets poo-pooed and shoved under the rug, ignored, openly opposed. But Christianity and most of the rest of the world, and much of Christianity in this country to this day, still contains elements of this. And the reality is that there isn't a whole lot in the Bible about this not being true.
Right.
And there's not very much in the Bible about some of this, quote, being wrong.
Have you ever been in a place like that?
Yes.
One night I slept at, what's the name of that town? In the middle of the Edwards Plateau. I just had to just.
Were you on vacation? What were you doing up there?
Edwards Plateau is a very
Yeah, I know where it's at.
famous little town.
Yeah.
Up there. And gone up there with the state of Texas, looking into managing wildlife.
Oh, okay.
And we stayed there at that hotel.
And that was that, you have medicine there?
Well, there was quite a few people that stayed in that hotel. And, we ended up getting one of the rooms upstairs, and in my life, we went up there and we prayed and went to sleep, and there were various people that I went to sleep and she went to sleep, and I usually wake up at 4 o'clock, 4:30, so I got up and started moving around, and I guess people heard me, moving around, and they started opening the doors, looking at me, and I just thought it was kind of weird, I got up early and I was thinking to myself, well, I guess I woke them up,
Yeah.
Well, when we all went downstairs, they were all saying the same thing, that they couldn't sleep because there was people walking up and down the hallway and opening and slamming the doors.
Yeah.
The hallway down to the outside of the bottom.
Yeah. See, I can speak of.
There's a lot of people, but they were dead. That's not.
I can speak about the.
You are a party pooper, that's all I know. You know, you only have a heart.
I've held my share of funerals in 50 years of ministry.
Oh, there you go.
So I have more than one story about people who had this conviction about what shouldn't be done, what did happen, might happen. I preached for 6 years and then taught for 2 years in the Appalachians of East Tennessee.
Oh, my.
You didn't get paid much, did you?
No, I didn't get paid much. And in the last job, they even ran out of money on me,
I
so.
was gonna tell you, you were getting paid too.
These spiritualist ideas are significantly held in
Oh, yeah.
in varying degrees of all kinds of ideals widely in many Christian groups. And then, of course, you have the modern American 20th century Christians, many of whom scorn all of these ideas and literally, and would laugh at you if you were to even bring them up. But they're still very, very common.
Well, that's just like remember Nancy Reagan, she used to make seances and all that.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
she always had a psychic. And
Yeah.
there have been other first ladies that are exactly.
Absolutely.
Because
Yeah.
I think
Abraham Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd, did it.
yeah. But I remember Nancy Reagan, I think, was real upset when he was shot because I think that it was Pat Dixon who was the psychic. And I think she told her something.
Yeah.
So, oh, it's
Yeah.
true, it's true. I think she thought he was going to die.
How many people in your church read their horoscope religiously every day?
Not really, but I should. Oh, Leo, what are you doing?
And so we shouldn't be surprised. And as you saw, you see, every one of these groups that we mentioned that organized still exist, have enough membership to have very attractive websites, and a whole variety of various organizations. One of those has, there's a Theosophy Society here in Houston, Spiritist group here in Houston. They're all still here as an alternative to the traditional Christian religious, especially institutional church.
Rock Springs, that was the name of that town.
Yeah,
Rock Springs, yeah.
Rock Springs.
It was the main hotel there, little bitty old little square.
Yep.
That's all there is to that little town, it's a little bitty old square.
Yeah.
Well, that's like this lady that, is a good friend of mine, she has a caretaker because she can't walk, and she's 95, but anyway. So this girl took off, I think, a couple of days ago, her and her husband and little boy. And she said that they were going to Mount Vernon, and I said, well, what is she doing up there? And she said, I still can't believe it, but supposedly they were spending the night in an old hospital, or hotel, maybe it's hotel, that was haunted.
Yeah.
So they, I guess, are getting lots of money up there, you know, so.
Sure.
But
But
there's,
I'm gonna get them to come to my house, and I'll make noise and stuff,
yeah,
and they pay like $300 to
save a lot of gas.
Oh, I could have did mine on the pool. I got it.
And you-
There's a lot of people that do that. They take it.
And
Oh, but it's not harming.
And of course, all of these procedures, all these activities are of such a nature that they're all capable of being copied,
Yeah,
imitated.
yeah.
There's always that little thing with people.
And so,
This may be true.
but of course, you see, you have the same problem in organized religion, where you have leaders who are there because this is a pretty good racket.
I know they want the money, and all they have the
This is-
power, is that they have a thing.
Absolutely, absolutely,
Benefits,
yeah.
yeah.
On the bottom of this page that I sent you, I've summarized from a couple of different sources several of the principles of the Spiritist groups, but these are pretty much across the board with all the spiritual emphases. unless they don't happen to believe that one of the spirits is in fact a creative spirit. And most religious groups, even much of Hinduism, you see, believes that there is some originating spirit, some underlying spirit. The brotherhood of man grows out of the fact that all of us are part of the spiritual world. But the reality is it's not just the brotherhood of man, it's the brotherhood of all the spirits. Continuous existence, which involves the transmigration or the reincarnation. Many spiritualists don't happen to believe in this. This is your one shot, man, so you better make the best of it. But and sometimes when you see an article about what's the difference between, that's the thing they mention, is that the spiritists believe in reincarnation, the spiritualists don't. Well, as a general rule, that may be true, but it's certainly not an absolute rule, because there are many spiritualists who aren't involved in one of the organized spiritist groups that believe in reincarnation too.
Well, how does this go in a spiritualist, and then how does it creep into being a cult? Is it because that
Well, in this case, they get included in the cult category mainly because of the false teaching that is involved. First, in the nature of man, that we're eternal, which is unchristian because God created us at some point. And we're of a different stuff than him and of different stuff than these other spiritual beings. But that's often a reality, as I've mentioned several times, that gets blurred in much of modern Christianity, where at the popular level, we are far more spiritualists than we recognize, because the vast majority of ordinary Christians believe that we are fundamentally a spirit that has a body.
And we'll go to heaven.
And the spirit will go to heaven.
Right.
And the body will disappear. And therefore, the resurrection is kind of a weird thing for us. It doesn't really make sense. And it doesn't, if that's your view. The real Christian view is that we are a composite. We're an amalgamation of spirit and material. And you can't have one without the other. We don't have any trouble imagining the spirit without the body, because we bury the body or we cremate it or whatever, and the spirit still goes on in some form or something or other. And we don't have any problem visualizing a spirit with full functional consciousness and all that kind of stuff without the body. That's not the Christian view. That's not the biblical view. When the spirit loses the body, the spirit is incapacitated. It doesn't have the body to function in. That's one of the things that often gets overlooked when we literalize the story of the rich man and Lazarus, and we have the rich man becoming aware of his torment, and he says, "Oh, golly, can you send Lazarus to put some water on my tongue?" Well, if he's a spirit in torment somewhere, he doesn't have a tongue. So you can't literalize the story. The rich man without his body isn't. There may be a spirit of him of some capacity, character, nature, somewhere for until the resurrection when Jesus comes back. But he doesn't have a body. So he doesn't have a tongue. He can't talk. I see it's easy for us to visualize telepathic communication between the spirits.
So if you were to see a spirit,
I don't know what you'd see. I don't know what you'd see. Because we human beings have our nature, our being, because God breathed into dirt his breath. And the dirt is as an essential part of our being as his breath is.
So when you die, you go,
I don't know what happens when you die.
so you don't have to go to
The Bible does not clearly describe. In fact, it doesn't tell anything
Well,
about
why
what
do
happens.
all Christians want to go to heaven?
so what about,
Because we've mythologized what we think we've read in the Bible.
so what
Okay,
about
so you're
Jesus?
talking about you'll see your loved ones, that's not true?
It's not in the Bible.
Oh,
That's my point. A while ago, I said most of what you're going to read about demons and angels, even in Christian writings, isn't in the Bible. It's just not there.
Well, then why?
And most of what you read,
Why are these churches, I mean, is it just to keep us from telling each other down here? But they're always putting that little flag in front of us, like, be good and you'll go to heaven. But if you're saying, you get there, you don't even know you're there.
no, I didn't say that.
Well, I mean, nobody else will know you're there because you know that.
No, I didn't say that
Okay,
either.
well, what did you?
I said the Bible doesn't say
But what am I?
what will happen. It doesn't say what happens when you die.
So what do you think happened to Jesus?
I don't.
When Jesus was resurrected?
Yeah, Jesus is
Jesus was rejoined with his body.
Okay, and then he walked on this earth.
Yes,
He
and
ascended.
in his body, which he still has.
In his body.
A body, a resurrected body, but a material body,
A physical body.
a physical body.
Like mine and yours.
Yes,
And he's in heaven.
yes,
Seated at the right side.
yes,
And just like him, then we will be there.
yes, yes.
But you won't know it.
And that makes,
You're not gonna get a body.
and
Nobody can say that because they haven't been there yet.
He just said it, he just said it, we're not gonna get a body.
And that's what makes the incarnation so incredible.
Yeah, for Jesus.
The incarnation was not a temporary thing. It was a permanent thing.
Before death. Before death, it was a permanent thing.
No, it was a permanent thing when when this word became flesh.
At the beginning.
Whenever that happened, when that happened, it was a permanent bond.
When sin came,
Yeah.
then what? It was a
Well, he was able to control sin. He was able to rebuff sin, even in the flesh. But the word became flesh. And that was a permanent engagement of the word on our behalf.
And it's gonna be like that after the.
It's going to be like that forever.
Forever.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he became man.
He will not be,
Cross, and so when he was resurrected, are you saying this is a body, this is,
no, it is. His body was resurrected.
but he was a man.
Yes.
And he went through all the torture and when he
Yes.
died,
He died and they buried the body.
we're not going to have a body.
Yes, we're going to have one too.
That's what I was trying to tell
I
you.
just thought he said we weren't.
No, we are. We have to have a body because without it, we aren't.
Well, see, that's.
And we're gonna be-
Yeah.
And we're gonna be here for eternity. And
Yeah.
at that time, night, the lion will lay with the lamb.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I always thought. and I didn't-
Well, except that that's a figure. The lion may still eat lambs because that's what lions do.
Yeah. You don't know that.
But there will be peace. There'll be wholeness. There'll be no pain.
No pain.
Yeah. but there'll be work.
But we need to work.
Of course. What would your body be if you don't do anything?
It was like this.
Your body atrophies, and your body is an essential part of your being. Without it, you aren't. Your spirit may be in some form, nature, character, quality, whatever, but it ain't you. It's only your spirit. And you aren't a spirit. We became a person, an individual, a soul. That's Genesis 2. God breathed into the dirt and it became a living soul. That's the Hebrew.
Jesus ascended
In a body
in the body.
that he was resurrected in, that he took out of the grave.
He left us the comforter.
Yes,
And he is here with us. isn't he?
yes, yes.
And he don't want you dwelling around with all these other spirits.
And
They don't know you.
the fundamental reason why he said it's good for me to leave so I can give you the Spirit is because the bodily Jesus, the Word in flesh, can only be in one place at one time.
Well, that's why he had to come.
So he sent the Spirit who doesn't have a body. So he can be everywhere all the time. But Jesus can't be everywhere all the time because he has a body. And a body can only be in one place at one time.
Something to think about.
Absolutely. Okay, what are we going to do next week? Did anybody come up with something?
Did we finish everything?
Well, do you want to talk about these spiritists and these spiritualists some more?
Not really, no.
Yeah, really.
If you want to spend more time on them, I'm open to that. Because you see, since they view the spirits, and the spiritists particularly, because they've organized this, the spirits are, Karnak's spirits, are in constant progression from whatever situation they're in, whatever state they're in, whatever moral quality they possess, to some kind of perfection. And that's a natural progression that happens with all spirits. It happens faster if you're more disciplined, if you're more informed, but it's going to happen eventually for everybody. That, of course, you see, means you don't need a Messiah, you don't need a Savior, you don't need an atonement, because this is strictly a matter of moral progression.
Well, that's why I have some people, I guess, living on these different religions.
Sure. And so you see, these spiritualists,
They believe.
or the spiritists themselves, could in fact be a pretty good member in any church that wouldn't frown on them and constantly point out to them their errors about this or that or the other thing. And in many churches, they would be pretty comfortable, because outside of some specific issues of this spiritual progression without the need of a Savior, and the reality, you could argue, there are probably even some that, especially who came from Christian background, who may have even encompassed Jesus in this progression. And so you'll make a faster progression if you follow Jesus.
I think that's what you did with the Unity Church.
And yeah,
Because I know,
yeah.
I was reading about that. It was started here in Houston in the Heights on Rutledge Street,
Mhm.
back in the 1800s. But they believe that it's spiritual, I guess, because they believe in Jesus Christ, and that's what they teach. But they also do have people to come in that are I guess, spiritualists because they believe like in Buddhism and Hinduism.
Yeah, oh, yeah,
So they have encompassed the whole.
oh, yeah.
And like, you know, the one that ran for a Democrat as the president, Mary Ann, what's her last name, just recently. Anyway, she's part of that
Yeah.
from Houston. But, so
The
I
unity.
could see that, unity.
Yeah,
I could see, because what I have a problem with sometimes is, of course, not Christianity, because I'm a Christian, but certain denominations, they think, and maybe it's true, but they think like if you are a Hindu, which I would be a Hindu probably if I lived in India, you know, I probably would have been one, but they think that you're going straight to hell, you know. And I personally, I just don't see that. I don't understand how they can think that. But I do know the Bible and I do know what it says, but it's just strange to me how they can cut some people out, you know, like,
well,
you're gonna have hell.
all you have to do is take a hardline view that there is no life apart from Jesus.
Jesus, I know, and that's.
And so if you're not a believer in Jesus, then when you die, it's over.
But you can be a believer in Jesus and still just, I just don't see how Jesus can have these other people in other parts of the country die. You know, I just don't see that. I mean, just if you're a Christian,
Well, obviously,
you're a good person, you should-
obviously, we need to pray for you.
But that's what they did, though.
Yeah, but see, there is a strong view underlying mainline Christianity that salvation is a limited privilege. That once the original human beings, Adam and Eve, turned their back on God, the whole human race for eternity was cut off from God. And that's the reality. Except that God, in his sovereignty, decided that he didn't want to be alone. And so he would rescue some of those people. And so he set in motion a plan to rescue some of those people. Only a remnant, only a few. He didn't have to do that. And by golly, we're really glad he did, because he chose me. And therefore, there is no problem. Because the reality is everybody should go to hell. Thank goodness God decided that he wanted a few of us. And then depending on what your view of the sovereignty of God is, as to how he did that, as to how open that is, if at all. And so you have a strong, large strand of Christianity who believes it's not open at all. That of the billions of people who will be born upon this earth, God has chosen only 144,000. I don't know if anybody sticks to that number anymore, except maybe a few really radical offside groups. But figuratively, he chose these alone. And so in some of their theologies, they even go as far to say, since he chose only these, then Jesus only had to die for them, because the rest of them are never going to be saved anyhow, so there wasn't any point for him to die for them. And of course, it follows then through their theology as to who these people are, how they're chosen, and what happens to them. And everybody else, sayonara.
Were you around here in the 1980s?
No.
You here in Houston?
The early 80s.
In the late 80s, I was here. I was here in the 60s, and then I came back in the late 80s.
Did you ever hear of Daniel, the 9-year-old boy, 2-year-old boy?
I don't guess so.
That was going around here preaching here in this area?
No.
Did y'all ever, he's 9 years old, and he would preach,
Yeah.
and he would just start to talk, and he would be preaching the word of God. And after that, he was just like a little kid, 9 years old.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are numerous stories like that. And you really want to get it to be a heretic. You've got some groups that have some women like that.
Not because women are always put down, that's another problem.
There are some groups where the prophet, the prophetess is a woman. She's the preacher. She's the proclaimer. Yeah. And you see, there, in opposition to that strong view, there is a slightly mitigating view that we human beings aren't immortal innately. And so when we are born, we, like all other human beings in this fallen world, are sinners, and we're going to go to hell. Except that, in their view, there is no place like that. What happens when you die is you're dead, and it's over. The people God wants to save for himself, he pulls out of this mass of humanity, and he brings them to Jesus, and he saves them for an eternal relationship with him, and they get to live forever, but everybody else is gone.
So there's no hell.
No, there's no real hell. And of course, then you get a slightly mitigating group of those who say, well, yes, clearly there's some kind of situation, judgment and punishment and that kind of thing, but it's not eternal.
Right.
It doesn't, because you're not eternal. You're not eternal. So there's no way God can punish you forever, because you're gonna die. You're gonna cease to exist. And so your choice really is, do you want to live or die? Do you want to live forever, or do you want to die?
That Swedenborg, that Emmanuel Swedenborg,
Uh-huh.
traditionalistic Christian theologian, scientist, philosophic, and mystic, and he's best known for his book on the afterlife, Heaven and Hell,
Yes.
1758.
Yeah. And most of what he wrote about the afterlife, you won't find in the Bible, because he wasn't concerned about being limited to the Bible. He was open to the truth of reality. And so wherever he could find what to him appeared to be true,
That's what he wrote.
he could proclaim as true. And whatever level of evidence, whatever kind of evidence satisfied him with that, he could present, and it would be a closed case in his view.